Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK round number 2 overview and analysis video. We've already got our final 4 teams here in the LCK in the summer split. One of the 4 teams that we cover today will be your 2023 LCK summer split champion, and we're going to get a lot closer towards that goal in today's episode. Of course, we're going to be going over round number 2. We saw, of course, both DRX and D plus Kia get eliminated, I believe in yesterday's video. It might have been a couple of days ago now. The upload schedule has been wild. I can't even remember what order all these videos have come out in, but today we're going to be covering winners round number 2. So by the end of this video, we're going to know winners finals as well as the 2 teams that are going to have to face off to see who the first of the 4 eliminated is in the upcoming days. And I'm really excited to go over these series because I think both of them are pretty interesting, and all 4 of the top 4 teams left I think are competitive and can do a lot. And so really going to be interesting to see how things end up shaking out. But of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of these games. What do you think of these teams? How do you think they're going to be moving forward? Did anything surprise you? Were there any upsets? Did any players or teams surprise you in a good or a bad way? Would love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is we're going to go game by game in each of the 2 winners round number 2 series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual performance, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of wrap everything up. At the end of the episode, we're going to quickly go over both winners finals and losers round number 2 so that we can kind of, prep for those series coming up in the next video. But for the most part today, we're just going to be talking about these 2 series. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. It's going to be a really intriguing matchup first and foremost, probably the more interesting of the 2, in my opinion, in this first matchup, because it is a historic rivalry, the historic rivalry here in the LCK, as we have the number 1 seeded KT Rolster taking on the number 5 seeded T1. The telecom wars are in full effect, and this time the roles are reversed, typically speaking, from what we've seen from these 2 teams. T1, kind of the underdogs, really not, being all that consistent in the regular season, mostly because of Faker's time off, him going away, and Owner, and, Guma and Keria and Zeus all struggling, right? However, this team certainly has gotten back into the groove as of late. They ended up being able to take down D plus Kia relatively easy in a series that should have been a lot more difficult if they were as bad as they were in the regular season, but that just doesn't look like it's going to be the case. This looks like a T1 that very well could win the LCK, and I'm very surprised. I'm going to be entirely honest, very surprised to have seen KT Rolster select them. I talked about this in the previous video. I would not have selected T1 in this situation. I very much would have selected Hanwha Life. We'll see if that comes back to bite KT, but they want to take the challenge. They want to take on their rivals, the biggest rivalry here in the LCK, and, honestly, you got to respect them for opting into this matchup. KT has been basically unbeatable ever since the first week of the season where they lost to Gen.G. They have not dropped a single series since then. It's been, 2 months since they've lost a series, which is incredibly impressive, and basically everybody on this team has started scaling into the late game, if you will, of this season. Everybody's really stepped up. Keen and I think Lehens in particular are the 2 players that most people are going to look at as kind of the superstars of KT Rolster, but everybody's been playing well. BDD's been really good. Aiming has gotten a lot better over the back half of the split, and Cuz has been crazy efficient. And so KT Rolster really clicking on all cylinders. This is the best version of this team that we've seen in many years, probably since 2018. And, T1 obviously has kind of owned this matchup, but it's certainly going to be intriguing to see if they can step up where they weren't able to do that in the regular season. Remember, KT did win both series against T1 in the regular season, so T1's going to have to try to reverse the curse, but are they going to be able to do that? Well, we're going to find out at the very least, starting with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was KT Rolster. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is looking like the KT that I think we all wanted to see it going into the playoffs. I talked about this series being incredibly close. I really couldn't pick a winner definitively, as you guys saw in my LCK playoff primer video when I did my full bracket prediction. I had KT going over once, I had T1 going over the other time when they faced later on in the bracket, and so I really didn't know who to pick in this series. I thought both teams were relatively evenly matched, and a lot of it was going to be which version of T1 showed up, and I think luckily for KT, this was the bad version of T1, at the very least in the first game of this series. KT just completely rolled over them. I think a lot of the negatives in this game can actually be pointed to on T1, and kind of them messing up and not necessarily playing up to their talent level, rather than KT pushing the tempo and being fantastic. But you do still have to give KT credit for being able to capitalize on a lot of those mistakes, for being able to sit down and go, okay, you know, they're going to mess up and they're going to do quite a few things, but we know what to do when you give us resources. We know how to scale a game out of control, and this game really did scale almost entirely out of control for KT very, very, very quickly. Player of the game was actually kind of difficult. I do think almost everybody on KT played really well this game, and I definitely considered quite a few people, but I ended up giving it to Aiming in the bot lane on the Zeri. Zeri, just generally speaking, is in a pretty decent spot right now. In terms of balance, I think a lot of people still complain about Zeri, you know, for various different reasons. I think mostly because of fatigue, and again, I understand it. Zeri's been omnipresent in pro play over the past couple of years, but I really don't think she's in that bad of a spot right now for what she's able to do. If you're able to pilot Zeri at a high level, if you're the better AD carry, then you're going to look really good on a champion like Zeri, because you can self-peel, you can stay relatively out of range, and if your positioning and your spacing is good, then you're going to be pretty strong in a game like this, and I thought Aiming did a really good job with that. Was definitely the best member of the bot lane, you know, not only just on KT, but especially compared to T1. Was not a particularly close matchup down there, and the Zeri got a little bit too far ahead to really be able to be caught up with, I guess you could say. I think Broadcast ended up giving player of the game to BDD. That one I understand as well, that Tristana was very aggressive and oftentimes was creating a lot of plays, especially in the late game team fights. It really was very noticeable that the Tristana was doing incredibly well. Now, that's not exactly how you play Trist, but this is a good example of the way to play this comp, right? You've got the Zeri for kind of late game scaling and insurance policy, if you will. You've got the Gragas in the top lane to kind of help out with that. Even the Nautilus can help set up in the late game, and then you've got the Rel plus the Tristana as your jungle mid duo to apply a ton of pressure in the early to mid game. I like the idea behind this comp, and I think KT did execute it well. You need that Tristana to be active. You need BDD to be moving around the map to be a big positive for this KT team, and I think luckily he was, and I think definitely that was a big part of it. Cuz was obviously really good on the Rel in that same vein. A lot of those engages ended up being majorly positive, and the early game coming in from Cuz, I think, was incredibly important. I think if KT was not able to generate nearly as much momentum as they were able to get in, you know, the first 10-ish minutes of this game, I do think that T1 could have played a little bit more comfortably, because look at their comp. They scale into oblivion, but the big problem with T1's comp is they have no early game pressure. You're relying a ton on the Sejuani to actually be able to keep up in tempo with the Rel, and as long as Rel stays aggressive and is looking for trades, and, you know, as long as the Azir doesn't somehow win lane against the Tristana, you're probably in a really good position, because no one else is really going to be able to generate a large enough lead for it to really matter. And so I think Cuz obviously did a great job being able to generate that lead, but that was mostly him just kind of taking advantage of the comp difference, in my opinion. Keen was good, Lehens was really good. Everybody on KT stepped up, but like I said, this really was a bit of T1 just kind of struggling, in my opinion, in my eyes. I don't really know what they were doing in this game. A lot of just mental errors. This looked a lot closer to what the team looked like when Faker was not in the lineup. Just a lot of really weird things. Dud of the game's going to go to Keria, but man, you could absolutely give this to Gumayushi as well, who was miserable. You could give this to Owner in the jungle, who just kind of got run over on the Sejuani. Faker was completely useless this game. It really was just Zeus that was playing relatively well for T1, but everybody else in this team just did not have a good game, and I'm not exactly sure what ended up happening. A lot of people are going to point to Keria's like 5 straight minutes of just AFKing in the enemy's jungle. I would spam pinging him if I was in solo queue. I have no idea what he was doing. It reminded me so much of like what Sylvie would do randomly throughout the regular season on Nongshim, where he would just like sit in the jungle for no reason. I have no idea what the play was for Keria, but it didn't work, and it cost his team so much pressure because his entire team had to play 4v5 for like 5 minutes. Again, really not sure what was going on there, who made that call, but it's not like the rest of his team was actually playing up to snuff. The Sivir absolutely did not work out. I've been very vocal on this channel about how I think Sivir is an incredibly overrated pick at the current moment. I think it's one of the weaker bot laners in the meta, I guess you could say, because I do think that there are weaker AD carries just in the game, but of the ones that are getting picked, I do think Sivir is probably the one that I have the least amount of confidence in. That and the Lucian, I just don't think necessarily work out. Sivir just takes way too long to get online, and especially if you're going to go into something like Zeri, you're not even really going to be able to match Zeri in the late game, and so you're looking at this comp of like Sedge, Azir, Sivir, and even like the Jax. Like, where are you supposed to generate your pressure early? I would have liked almost anything else in this spot other than the Sivir, and I do think that came back to bite them. Gumayushi had literally no presence in this game. I don't even think he existed. And then Owner was consistently trying to make plays, but like I said, Cuz was just so far ahead in tempo that oftentimes the Sedge would just go in and die, basically, instantly. Faker had no pressure in the mid lane because he's playing Azir into Tristana, and the jungle matchup's not in his favor. Zeus was probably the most active member of T1 in this series, but, you know, there's only so much he could do in game number 1 here on the Jax. He was split pushing, he was able to generate some leads, and when he did get into team fights, he was dealing damage, but the problem is if the rest of the team is super far behind and you're going in to a strong Tristana and a strong Zeri, like, Jax is not going to be able to deal with that all that efficiently. There's enough peel, especially with the Gragas on the side of KT Rolster, to basically make the Jax completely irrelevant, and so very difficult game for T1, and they really did not look up to snuff. I was kind of predicting them to hold their own in this series, but after game 1, it's definitely looking a little bit more dicey, but of course, it's only the first game. They can still bounce back, and then for KT, this is a really nice win. It really did establish a lot of pressure to start this series. If they can keep this up, they're going to be in a really good spot, but T1 does not want to fall down 0-2, so are they going to be able to tie up this series, or is KT going to take a dominant lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and this is exactly what we wanted to see. I saw a lot of people after game number 1 already proclaiming this to be a 3-0 sweep, that KT was completely locked in for the next round, that T1 clearly was just not going to show up, and they weren't good enough to be able to handle KT Rolster. We can never say that about a telecom war. Of course it's going to be close. They're always close. That's how these two teams play each other. To see T1 bounce back in a really nice way in game number 2 and honestly have a little bit of a strong game of their own, I think is exactly what I wanted to see. They were a little bit more, you know, specialized, I would say, in the lanes that did end up dominating, but I do think everybody on the team had a much better game in game number 2 than they did in game number 1, and that's really all you can ask for in a circumstance like this, is just to see improvement from the team from game to game, considering how bad game number 1 was. But for KT on the other side, there were definitely some concerns. Like I said, a couple of players still playing all right. We'll talk about them in a bit, but a couple of players just kind of getting outplayed in game number 2, and it's certainly going to raise some question marks about whether or not that's something they need to be concerned about moving forward in this series. So let's talk about it, starting with my player of the game, which pretty no-brainer in this one is going to go to Zeus in the top lane for T1 on this Rumble. Crazy good game from Zeus. Really loved what I was able to see from him. He was awesome in their series against D+ Kia as well. Was certainly in the conversation for player of the series there, and he was awesome in game number 2 here. It's going to be interesting to see if he can continue that through the whole series, because he is going into Keen, who a lot of people have said is like far and away the best top laner in the LCK. I certainly don't think it's far and away. I think Doran has obviously been really good over the course of this split, and Zeus we've seen do really well in the past, and this was a game where Zeus absolutely got the upper hand. However, it is on an incredibly strong pick in the Rumble. I think Rumble's just good at basically every part of the game right now. Not only is he going to be pretty solid in the early game, kind of neutralizing a lot of Renekton just in general, because Renekton wants to go in, he wants to try to trade, and it's really hard to trade with Rumble. It's just very difficult to be able to come out of those trades feeling at all good about them, but, you know, Rumble's also super useful in the team fight stage. I would argue he's probably the best team fighter in the top lane right now, and maybe outside of like Ornn, like if you really want to go that route, but I still think Rumble is probably better in terms of what he offers just overall, and I think Zeus obviously piloted him well. He was everywhere this game. The amount of damage that Rumble was able to do, surprised this pick fell all the way to second rotation, because I just don't think that it should. It really is that good, and I think Zeus obviously knows how to use it. But everybody else on the team was solid in that same vein. Keria in particular, I thought was very active on the map on the Nautilus. When Keria is active, when he's out there making plays consistently, this team looks better because of it. They really do run a lot through him as a player. There was a reason he was the MVP in Spring Split, and that's because I think a lot of T1's offensive plays, especially in the mid game, do kind of run through and are created by Keria in the support position. So good to see him have a good game. Gumayushi got the Draven and he got his cash out, so he was, you know, in a pretty good spot. He was definitely rolling in terms of the damage. And they also go for the Nocturne Neeko. If you follow the channel, you'll know I'm a little bit lower on Nocturne Neeko as a duo, mostly because of the Nocturne. I think Neeko is a good pick, but Nocturne can just be very hit or miss for me. Although this was one of the better games that I think Nocturne has had. I've been very low on this pick's output. I actually like Nocturne as a pick generally in pro play, but it's just not worked. And I'm more so leaning towards results rather than just my preconceived notions about the champion. And honestly, the results have not been good, but this was a good game. And so, you know, we'll take that into account. But just in general, I thought T1 played well, and they did everything they were supposed to in this game, which I think is all that really matters. And then for KT on the other side, a couple of lanes really struggled. Mostly top lane, obviously. That's the one that I think people are going to look at. Keen is going to get my dead of the game. The Renekton just wasn't useful at all. We've seen Renekton consistently be the highest priority top laner, and we've seen why over the course of the regular season in particular. particular, but as we've gotten further and further into playoffs, we've seen Renekton get worse and worse and worse in terms of actual outcomes. We've seen Orm, we've seen Rumble, we've seen K'Sante. So many picks end up kind of rising in popularity that end up just beating Renekton and making that champion a lot more difficult to pilot in a blind pick sense, and I think that we're starting to experience that again here. Now, Keen did not play this matchup well at all, was consistently giving health leads over to Zeus, so the laning phase was almost entirely in favor of the Rumble, and then basically at that point, Renekton has nothing to do in the game, not going to be nearly as useful in the back half, but, you know, there were some plays that I think Keen made towards the back half of the game that were interesting, just not enough to really make it worthwhile. Cuz was also completely out-jungled, in my opinion. Pressure was entirely in favor of the Nocturne and the Nico. I think by the time they hit like 12, 13 minutes into the game, KT was playing so scared of a full engage that there really wasn't a lot of actual aggressive plays coming out from them. But I think everybody else was like relatively fine. Like Lahan's aiming, I think we're relatively good, trying to stay active and trying to stay relevant in this game. Aiming had gold, it just didn't really matter. Varus with gold is not nearly as good as Draven with gold. And then BDD was just kind of neutral in this game, wasn't really super positive or super negative. Overall, I would say KT definitely needs to kind of figure out what they want to do in draft. T1 took a very big risk here going with basically no frontline. Like, you just have the Nautilus, but he's going to be full engage. I don't know if I'd necessarily consider him frontline. And then you've got Nocturne and Draven and Nico and Rumble. You've got so much damage, but they paid off because they were better. Like, they won their lanes, and so they were able to win the game, and that really was as simple as it comes. And now the series is tied up at 1 apiece. Obviously, Game 3 is going to be very important, and taking control of the series is going to be very important, but which team is going to be able to do that? Well, we'll find out right now, because the winner of game number 3 was T1. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take control of this series. They're going to go up 2-1. And man, this is a big win for T1. It really did feel like blue side was just going to be the dominant side again here in the playoffs, because that's how it's kind of been basically in all, especially the eastern regions, where blue side has just been crazy strong, and these teams aren't really separatable all that much in a lot of other ways, and so if you are able to get that blue side, you're just in a really good spot. But T1 breaking the pattern here, winning on red side in game number 3, probably going to be massive for them, and again, it's just a lot of really good individual performances for them. I think you could talk about KT certainly having more of a game plan going into this one, certainly having more of an idea of what they want to do, but just not being able to execute nearly as well. They had a couple of early game moments that looked relatively okay, but they couldn't hang on to any of it. As soon as T1 got a little bit of gold, they just started running and they just started outplaying KT, which I think is definitely a major concern for KT fans who want to see this team move on, because right now, through the first 3 games, it really does feel like T1 is just kind of better. Like, obviously, game 1 was definitely in favor of KT, so I'm not going to rule them out. But this is not a great sign that KT is going to be able to keep up and hang with T1. They're now only 1 game away from moving on to winners finals, and KT is 1 game away from losing their first playoff series as the number 1 seed, who only lost 1 series all year, all split long, and it was in the first week of the season. And so, you know, a lot going on, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is, again, going to go to Zeus in the top lane. You know, underrated, he's been unbelievable, like phenomenal over the course of this playoff run. Obviously, he's been great in this series so far, has been the best player in this series so far, but I know that Zeus gets this bad rap for being like a playoff underperformer, and there have been times where it's certainly started to seem like, okay, especially in finals, like he doesn't necessarily step up as much as the rest of this team, but he's clearly taken a lot of that to heart, and he's clearly tried to work on it. He's talked about that in interviews, and specifically before this series, he talked about it a lot, and so I really think he came in like super motivated, super determined to end up being a big part of this team's game plan, and boy howdy has he been a big part of this team's game plan. A fantastic K'Sante game. Obviously, this champion is ridiculous in terms of what he's able to accomplish, but you still have to pilot him right, and Zeus absolutely still piloted him right. Keen had a much better game on the other side of the map, but really what Zeus was doing was taking over in the late game, taking over in the teamfight stage, and just making it basically impossible for KT to get off any of the combos that I think they were looking for. You know, obviously, you've got the Nocturne Nico, you've got things like Galio full engage on top of potentially Nocturne, right? You've got a lot of combos to end up going in for, but if K'Sante just kind of separates the entire fight, then all of a sudden this becomes a lot more difficult, and so Zeus playing incredibly well. I want to give a major shout out to Owner, who mentally, he's getting the honors this game. That's all I'm saying. He got perma-targeted in the early game by Cuz, by BDD, by Keen on the other side. Everybody was trying to make sure that this Maokai got super far behind, and to their credit, I guess they technically did their job, but Owner was still super relevant towards the back half. His team fighting was actually phenomenal, and he was really good in the mid game as well. And I certainly don't think a worse jungler would have been in nearly as good of a spot as Owner was in by the time we hit 20 minutes into the game if, you know, they weren't Owner, right? I think that's really the positive to take away. The mental on him was fantastic, and just being able to rebound from that was a really big positive. I understand the idea of attacking Owner, and I do like that idea. You know, going against T1, we've seen Owner struggle a little bit when he's playing from behind, and certainly his mental has been questionable over the course of this split, but, you know, it was tested in this game, and he came out on top. Keria and Guma were really good. Lucian Alistar is not a lane that I would want to be picking in 2023, but they pulled it off because they're really good, and Faker was really good on the Azir as well. A lot of fantastic engages, a lot of great ultimates coming in from Faker, so for T1, just a good game overall. This is what you want to see, them being able to take charge, and they're one game away from moving on to winners finals, but for KT, they cannot allow that to happen easily. That would be a disaster, especially after you won game 1. To lose all 3 in a row would be a disaster, and honestly, game 3 was not good from them. They had a couple of moments. It really did feel like their game plan in the early game was solid. They wanted to play a lot around this like trio combo of Nocturne, Nico, and Galio, trying to consistently invade, trying to consistently play for the macro advantage because they knew they could just kind of get everywhere on the map as soon as they wanted to. If Nico finds a pick in the jungle, then all of a sudden Nocturne's ulting in and Galio's ulting in, and you've got a ton of follow-up. You potentially have an Ezreal ult coming in as well, and so a lot of different things that could kind of compound, but the problem is they kind of just got outplayed, and so the combo never really got off. My dud of the game is going to go to BDD on this Nico. A lot of those Nico ultimates and engages just ended up really not working out for this team, and I think that was very, very apparent in game number 3. I think that, you know, BDD, Cuz, and Lehens, I think were all candidates for dud of the game here. Again, you really need that combo to end up working out, and I think KT, you know, falling so flat in terms of the mid game on that combo ended up being a major issue for this team overall. And then, obviously, you had someone like Aiming who was just kind of useless this game. The Ezreal's not really going to be all that valuable if you're playing against, you know, an Azir and a Cassante that are just much stronger than you are at that point, especially trying to go into Maokai Alistar. You're just simply never going to break through that front line. And then, you know, Keen was okay. I think he had a lot of bad moments, but he had a lot of good moments as well. More of an up and down game, I would say, than what we've seen from him over the course of the regular season, but Zeus has been such a positive on the other side of the map that Keen being the worst of the 2 top laners is certainly becoming at least a little bit of a problem for KT Rolster. There are a lot of concerns on this team in this series, and they're now down 1-2. They are on series point here, so they have to win both of the final 2 games. Obviously, that's more than possible for this team, but they've got to start it off here with game number 4, and T1 could close the series out if they wanted to. So who's going to get their way? Is it going to be a 4-game series, or is KT going to bring us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was KT Rolster. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up this series at 2 apiece, and we are going to be moving to a game number 5 in this telecom war. Why did we ever expect anything else? Of course we were going to be moving to a game number 5. That's just how these 2 teams end up operating when they play against each other. It's always fun, it's always close, and it's always interesting to watch, and so why would this be any different, especially with both teams actually being incredibly good right now? So I'm really, really excited to see this game number 4 win from KT. Of course, I do think they played much better here in game 4. We're still looking at a lot of differences. I think T1 did have a little bit more of a chance here in game 4 than they maybe did in game number 1 when KT just kind of blew them out of the water. But I think the problem with T1 was they went for another very risky, very aggressive comp, and this time they just didn't have the damage to back it up. Typically speaking, that's kind of been what's carried them through the series up until this point, is just their ridiculous amount of damage, their ridiculous abundance of aggression, and unfortunately, they just weren't able to match that in this game. Good stuff from KT to kind of fight fire with fire, if you will. But player of the game for me, and this one is going to go to Keen in the top lane. Been a little bit hesitant on him over the course of this series. Not because I think he individually has been very bad, but rather, I do think that KT Rolster has struggled without the ability to play towards topside nearly as efficiently. Zeus has been spectacular on the other side of the map, and so Keen has really kind of fallen under the radar, or, you know, under the blanket, if you will, and I do think that he looked a lot better, a lot better in game number 4 here. A lot more like the Keen that we had gotten used to. This was a dominant Renekton performance, and if we're ever going to see a dominant Renekton performance, it's kind of wild to see it go into Aatrox, which I think has been such a massive pick for basically everybody in the LCK playoffs, in the LCS playoffs, you know, basically everybody who's on 13-14. This has been a massive pick for them, and, you know, we've seen the Renekton obviously be the most picked top laner, but mostly because of its stability, and, you know, this was not a stable game from Keen, this was a carry game from Keen, which is, again, exactly exactly what you needed to see in this circumstance. I think this team would have been in a lot more trouble had Keen not been nearly as good as he was this game, but the rest of the team was also great. Cuz was consistently engaging basically all over the place. He's looked really good on the rel. This has been a pick that I would expect KT to want to go back to a couple of times, because I do think every time that he's given the opportunity to play aggro in the early game on the rel, to be able to, you know, kind of run the game, gank a lot if you will, I do think that Cuz does really well on this pick, and so hopefully, you know, they recognize that and they want to go towards it more in the future. Might be a ban candidate for T1 in my opinion. The Tristana, crazy strong right now. We'll talk about Faker's Nico, not exactly working out. Nico in general, not working out all that much in pro play. Same thing with the Nocturne. I just don't think that that duo has been all that good. We'll see the alternative of that in just a second, but, you know, aiming, Lahens, everybody on KT was really solid in this game. It was Keen that kind of ran things, but the damage coming in from BDD was also a very big deal on Tristana, and so the solo laners definitely stepping up, creating a lot of aggression, creating a lot of division on T1, and their team fight just wasn't enough to be able to pull it back. And I really do think that you can look at the comp mostly for that. I do think that some of the plays that they made in the back half of the game were obviously not perfect, but they did put themselves in a position where maybe with a little bit of a different circumstance, they could have actually won some fights in the back half of this game. The problem was they picked Samira on R5, and Samira is just not good right now. I don't really know what Guma is doing this series so far. He has picked Sivir, he has picked Lucian, and he has picked Samira. I don't know if this is limit testing. I don't know if he just doesn't want to play what's strong in the meta right now, but I just don't get it. You ban out Zeri, Kai'Sa, and Xayah, and you opt into Samira. I don't get it. Maybe I'm missing something. Like, I don't know, but Samira's not good, and Guma has struggled a lot to really do anything. He's gonna get my dead of the game here, and it's not because he himself played all that bad. I think his positioning was actually relatively good. He was consistently going in at the right time, following up with a lot of the engage from the Alistar and even from the Aatrox. The problem is Samira does, like, no damage. He was getting consistent 3-4 man perfect ultimates coming in from the Samira, and it was doing literally nothing to a comp that, quite frankly, should be taking damage from Samira. And so, I don't know, man. Maybe Guma's just, like, handicapping himself, but over the course of this series, he has almost exclusively picked AD carries that I would consider to be weak. And I don't know, like, maybe it's a T1 thing. Like, I don't get it. This has been a huge detriment to their series. I legitimately do kind of think that if you had picked an AD carry that was a little bit stronger than what Samira is at the current moment, that you might have a chance to win this game. Like, that's how big of a difference I think that made. So Guma's going to get my dead of the game, not even again entirely due to his own performance, but rather due to the fact that he was kind of useless in this game. And then outside of that, I think that obviously Faker really struggled on the Nico. I think in general, Nico is just kind of a pick that really has not, you know, popped off the page for me. There's been some really big highlight plays, and there's going to be games where obviously she looks incredibly strong. But I think for the most part, she's just kind of been meh as a pick overall. Keria was not very good on the Alistar. Zeus struggled on the Aatrox more so than he did in any of the first 3 games. Just in general, I think T1 looked a little bit less dominant, but all of this, of course, was just to set up the game number 5. The winner is going to be moving on to winners finals. The loser will not be eliminated. We do have double elimination now that we've reached the top 4 teams in the LCK, and so loser will move down into lower bracket. Winner will move on to winners finals. Who's going to take the title of winning the most recent telecom war, maybe one of the more important and interesting ones in recent memory? Well, the winner of game number 5 was T1. They are going to take game number 5. They're going to take this series and upset the number 1 seeded KT Rolster, sending them down into lower bracket in their first playoff series. I told you guys, I don't mean, this isn't a toot your own horn moment, because again, I really did think that the series could go either way, but seeing just the overwhelming favoritism towards KT Rolster going into the series, I didn't understand it, not because I think KT is bad, but rather because I think T1 is so much better than people are giving them credit for, and I do think that they proved that in this series. This is still one of the best teams in the entire world. I'm sorry, they just are, and they proved it in this series. I still like KT, and I still think that there is a chance that they rebound from this and go on to the LCK finals and end up winning it all. I truly do believe that that is absolutely still a path for KT Rolster, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but T1 absolutely deserves to be here, and they're going to be moving on to winners finals. They are top 3 guaranteed, and they are 1 series away from making the finals again. So really good stuff from T1, and again, it's the players that you wanted to see step up the most. First of all, I like this draft a lot more. We've been seeing Azir plus Kai'Sa as like a really stable combination because Azir does have a little bit of pressure in lane. He's not actually going to be able to move around the map. He's not going to give you tempo in the same way that something like Tristana is on the other side, but Azir can actually do something early game, which I think is nice. And then Kai'Sa obviously is just crazy broken. I just want to say in general, this is the only game this entire series where Gumayusi picked like an actually meta AD carry. You know, all the other games he picked Samira and, you know, the Draven obviously worked, but, you know, Lucian, Sivir, you know, things that I'm not nearly as big of a fan of. This was the first time he actually got a champion that I think people are kind of all agreeing is actually strong, and he looked unstoppable. This was easily his best game of the series. It's almost like when Guma gets, you know, a champion he can actually pilot, he's going to do well. But Guma and Keria were really good, but player of the game for me is going to go to Faker in the mid lane on this Azir. The damage he was able to output towards the back half of this game was actually incredible. Really, really good stuff coming in from him. Obviously, a lot has been said about Faker's, you know, resurgence and you know, him coming back into this team and them instantly getting better again. And obviously all of that stuff is still true. I'm not going to sit here and try and dispute any of that, but his individual mechanical skill has been a little bit more up and down. He's been targeted pretty heavily by basically every team that he's run into, but in this game, he absolutely made it work. He still was targeted, but his damage in the back half was more than enough to justify giving him player of the game. But player of the series as a whole, no brainer here. This was one of the easiest decisions I will ever make, is going to go to Zeus in the top lane. He owned this series. I mean, truly, at the end of the day, KT Rolster kind of got blasted by Zeus across this entire series, and that's what you want to see from Zeus in the playoffs. He had talked about, you know, how he had struggled, and he knew that he had struggled, and he really, really needed to step up, and I know he felt that pressure himself, and so to see him come out in this series against Keen, of all people, arguably the best top laner in the LCK, arguably the best top laner in the world, you know, Bin and 369 are certainly in that conversation, but Zeus, I should say, Keen, you know, was definitely in that conversation. For Zeus to come out and just straight up be better than him, I think is a really, really big sign overall for this team. So really good stuff coming in from T1. You'll love to see that. Owner was solid, not necessarily a superstar in this series, but kept his mental and helped out the rest of the team. And like I said, Guma and Keria looked a lot better when Guma was actually on an AD carry that could deal consistent damage over the course of the game in the Kai'Sa here in game number 5. So they're going to be moving on to winners finals, but KT Rolster is officially down in lower bracket, which is not, I think, where they wanted to be. It's the number 1 seed, like I said, that only dropped 1 series in week number 1. This is like worst case scenario. I still don't know why you picked T1. This felt like an obvious Hanwha Life selection to me, although, you know, hindsight's 2020, but go back to the video that I posted about round number 1. I was even talking about it then. Hell, go back to my playoff primer video, and I talked about how I would personally pick Hanwha Life. I just don't see a world in which this was the right matchup for you, and I think you're going to pay for it by going down into the lower bracket, losing that extra life when I don't think you had to. But dud of the game for me is going to go to Keen. I think he was okay. Like, he was at least trying to do things, but for the most part, Zeus was just straight up better than him in this game on the Jax, and that was kind of the case over the course of the whole series. Game 4 was definitely a little bit of an exception for that. Keen was obviously very good in Game 4, but in every other T1 win, especially, like, Keen was not very good in this series, and that certainly is at least a little bit concerning to see him kind of just get outplayed, but it wasn't just him. Cuz was kind of a complete non-factor in this series overall. Same thing for BDD. I think he did step up BDD, that is, more in their wins than he did in their losses. Obviously, really struggled in their losses, but Faker was better, I would say, across this series. Aiming and Lehens were generally just kind of irrelevant. Aiming was often put on things that just weren't able to deal consistent damage over the course of team fights, specifically that Ezreal, and it really just didn't end up working out, and so for KT, I don't really know what to say to you, right? Where do you go from here? You got to continue to have confidence in yourself. You ran into T1. You yourself chose T1, and you weren't able to overcome that hurdle, but T1 is certainly not a team that you should hang your head in losing to. You should feel pretty good that you at least, you know, kept up and went toe-to-toe with what is probably one of the best teams in the world, and you should be able to beat whoever is coming down to face you in lower bracket. You at least have to have the confidence that you're going to be able to beat whoever comes down to face you in lower bracket, and I do think that this team absolutely can do it. Like I said, if they go on this massive run down there and end up winning the LCK, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. I really do think that the top 3 teams are all incredibly inseparable at this point in terms of skill, and KT is definitely a part of that, but unfortunately for them, today was T1's day, and they're going to be walking out with the win. They're going to be moving on to winners finals, and they will own the most recent telecom war. But moving on now to our second series of round number 2 here, or at least the upper bracket of round number 2. And this one was definitely one that I was looking at on paper. Seed-wise, obviously, it's closer than 1 versus 5, as we just talked about. But I think, going into it, I had a little bit more of a concrete expectation for maybe what I thought we were going to get out of a series like this. Of course, I'm talking about the number 2 seeded Gen.G taking on the number 3 seeded Hanwha Life Esports. Matchup-wise, I've talked about this quite a bit on the channel. Again, this is another matchup that I predicted not only in my preview video, my playoff primer video, but in my round 1. I talked about this, a little bit towards the back half of that I do like this Hanwha Life team. I do think that they're peaking at the right time, and I think they are strong. I don't know if they're strong enough to be considered like a top 3 team in the league at the current moment, but they are very, very strong as a unit, as a team. However, matchup-wise, specifically into a team like Gen.G, I think they're just at a major disadvantage in my eyes. I actually see it as very, very difficult for Hanwha in this particular case. I think that they're really not a great matchup into a team like Gen.G, mostly because when you look at how Hanwha Life has really started to peak over the back half of the split, one name that comes to mind mostly is going to be Grizzly. His insertion into the lineup has really been a positive for Hanwha Life because they are able to play through him. Now, what we have seen very consistently for Hanwha is when Grizzly is able to generate leads and when he's able to play from ahead, this team does incredibly well. Grizzly's very active. He knows how to get his laners ahead, specifically Zeka in the mid lane. Those two have a very nice chemistry together, and Viper and Life are more than solid enough to win 2v2 bot lane without any sort of interference. Kingen is a solid weak side top laner. You're going to have a lot of success if Grizzly and Zeka can get online, but the problem with that going into Gen.G is they have probably the best jungle mid duo in the LCK, one of the best in the entire world, and it's been one of the best in the entire world for quite a long time in Peanut and Chovy. So this is not going to be a particularly easy matchup. Again, if Grizzly struggles, I would expect Hanwha Life to struggle a lot in this series. I know I've said that a billion times over the course of the last few weeks, but I really do see that as kind of the central narrative that needs to be surrounding Hanwha Life. Yes, I love Zeka, I love Viper, I think they're very, very good carries and they're very good players, but if Grizzly struggles, Zeka I think is going to struggle more to get online, and I don't know if Viper is going to be the type of player that's going to have enough resources to just be able to 1v9 in that way. We saw him struggle to do that when, his jungler wasn't doing all that well when Clid was in the lineup, and so for Hanwha, I think you're really relying on that jungle mid, but for Gen.G, just play your style. If you can go out there and outskill them, then I do think that you're in a pretty good spot. I think matchup-wise, you're actually very happy with this. I think you're very pleased that KT ended up selecting T1, and I think you're going to be moving into this series feeling pretty good about your chances. But am I right on that, or is Hanwha Life going to surprise me and really show up in a series like this? Well, we're going to find out at least starting in game number 1, because the winner of game number 1 was Gen.G. They are going to take the first game in this series. They are going to go up 1-0, and this is what I saw coming. I saw a lot of tempo advantage coming out from Gen.G, mostly on the top side of the map, that they were just able to translate into a strong mid game and close it out incredibly efficiently. This is a standard Gen.G game if I've ever seen one. This is exactly what this team likes to do. The only thing that they didn't, do in this game that they've done all split long is play a ridiculous amount towards bot lane. Paze has a ton of jungle proximity, and that's very apparent anytime you watch Gen.G, but they actually kind of flipped the script, and I think matchup-wise, this makes a ton more sense for them. Viper and Life are really good at surviving and making themselves useful, basically no matter the situation, Viper in particular, and so ignoring that bot lane and spending a lot more time on the top side of the map where these players are a little bit more volatile, I really like that decision, and it very much paid off for Gen.G. Player of the game for me is going to go to Doran in the top lane in game number 1 on this Aatrox. Phenomenal game from him. He led the entire game in damage, which is not particularly easy when you've got a strong Azir as well, but the Aatrox was massive, very difficult to actually deal with. When Doran in particular really gets this lead, and when the team plays for him, when he's given like strong side treatment, he's like really paid them out over the course of this year. Now, he'll have some bad games every once in a while. It's certainly not impossible. We saw that against Bro in the final week of the season, but I do think that, look back, week 6, week 7, week 8, Doran was arguably the best top laner in the LCK during that stretch. He was getting a lot of resources from his team, and he was able to pay them out in full, and that really was the case again here in game number 1. He was so much more useful than Kingen on the other side of the map that it honestly wasn't even really a matchup in my eyes. It was just kind of a domination. And Doran, by the time you got to the mid to late game, like nobody on the enemy team was even remotely going to be able to kill this Aatrox. Zeka was really the only one with any sort of gold on the side of Hanwha, and Yone is certainly not going to be able to deal with this champion all that efficiently. So really good stuff from Gen.G. Kind of funny to see Kingen fall to an Aatrox. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Chovy and Peanut were also really good this game in my opinion. Peanut was everywhere on the map. Certainly more active than someone like Grizzly, and I think he was a big reason why Doran was able to generate a lead, and Chovy in general is just so crazy consistent at being able to play matchups that I wouldn't even consider entirely in his favor. Like, Azir into Yone, I don't even think is a very good Azir matchup. Like, yes, you can get some poke in early because you're Azir, and that's just generally what you're going to do, but you can't really do anything with the pressure that you're able to generate mid-game, and Zeka's going to be super aggro in a lot of these skirmishes that Azir can't really match in the same way, and Zeka did a good job, but I think Chovy did a better job, and that really is to his credit. I think the top side of the map for Gen.G more than showed up in this game, and I think they're going to be excited about that. Pays and Delight were basically irrelevant in this game. Sivir is just a champion that, like I said, in a game like this where you're focusing top side and Sivir's weak side not getting resources, not scaling up, it's just not going to deal damage. Like, Sivir doesn't do anything when she's not super far ahead, and so we kind of saw that this game. The Sivir was irrelevant, but top side won hard enough for them to be able to win the game relatively easily, and then for Hanwha on the other side, kind of a frustrating game number one. You kind of just got blasted. Like, your strategy is pretty clear, I think, to anybody who watches your games, and I think that Hanwha is unfortunately kind of struggling with that right now. Grizzly lost tempo in the early game, and like I said, this team has been significantly worse having to play from behind, and that was exactly what happened in game number one. If there is a positive, it's Zeka continuing to try to make plays, continuing to try to be aggressive, was able to pick up some kills throughout the game, but really never had enough to be able to match the pressure that Chovy was actually able to output on the Azir, doing a really good job of balancing, you know, being aggressive while also making sure that he's not putting himself and his team in a position where they lose their scaling. But in general, it really was the top two members of the Hanwha Life team that struggled. I talked about Grizzly, but dud of the game for me is going to go to Kingen on the Ornn. Again, I think you could give this to Grizzly if you really wanted to. I think Grizzly did struggle quite a bit on the set 20 after playing from behind to really be useful at all, but Kingen, I don't think, did a single thing the entire game. Doran was dealing infinite amount of damage over the course of this game, and Kingen was consistently being targeted by a lot of pressure, was not really able to hold up, and by the time we hit even 10 or 11 minutes into the game, he was so far behind that he was never going to be anything but a negative for this HLE team overall, and so you definitely are going to be a little bit frustrated by that if you're Hanwha Life, but again, I think this is just really good scouting on the side of Gen.G, recognizing what Hanwha Life's weaknesses are and being able to capitalize on them. Viper and Life were here, and they were okay, I guess, but like by the time that they were ever going to be useful, the rest of the team had already lost hard enough for it not to matter, and that's how you beat Hanwha Life. You shut down the top side, and you make Viper not matter in the bot lane. You let him play some sort of scaling pick like the Kai'Sa, and you pick something that can be safe on the bot side to not give him any sort of advantages that can let him team fight towards the back half of the game. And so, good stuff from Gen.G. Basically everything I could have asked for in game number one. It does seem like they've done their research, and I think they've absolutely found kind of a good strategy, but Hanwha Life has enough talent to be able to adapt around that. Zeka and Viper are two incredibly good players, and we've seen Grizzly and Kingen and Life really step it up over the back half of the split, but they're going to need to do that here in game two. You certainly don't want to fall down 0-2 to Peanut and Chovy and Pays and Doran and Delight. Like, that is a nightmare scenario. So a big game two for both of these teams, but who is going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number two was Gen.G. They are going to take game number two. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and this is a dominating lead for Gen.G, and a lot of the problems that we identified ended up coming out. Now, it is worth noting this game was wild. You might not even get that entire impression just from looking at the graphic that I made, but let me tell you, Hanwha Life losing this game was completely and utterly unacceptable. Somehow, someway, they fight and claw their way back in. They were down in gold pretty heavily at about the 20-ish minute mark. They win a massive team fight and are able to get Soul, and they're able to get Baron, and all of a sudden it's looking super big for Hanwha, and then all of a sudden things completely fall apart. Gen.G, after throwing the lead the first time, ends up clawing their way back into the game, and now here we are at 2-0 for Gen.G, a massive win for them that, again, really shouldn't have happened, but you do got to give a lot of credit to basically everybody on this team for following up. You don't really win this game, I think, without all 5 of your players really stepping up when it matters the most around these major objective fights. And congratulations to Gen.G. They more than have earned this victory. Really, really good stuff, and they're in a really, really good position now. Obviously, 1 game away from going to winners finals, but 1 game away from making sure that they don't drop into lower bracket. Facing KT would be a pretty big disaster for this Gen.G team so early on, and so to see them up, pretty heavily here is definitely a good thing. Player of the game for me in game number 2 is going to go to Peanut in the jungle. I thought he was the most consistent member of this team over the course of this game. He did a really good job in the early game trying to make sure the Grizzly, again, had to play from some level of deficit. Now, it wasn't nearly as extreme as in game number 1. Grizzly still had a lot of opportunities to create action and to create plays for the rest of the team. And I actually think he did a really good job in the mid to late game at being able to be relevant in a lot of these team fights. The Sejuani was actually a pretty massive piece for Hanwha Life over the course of this game, and unfortunately it just didn't end up mattering in the end because Peanut was a little bit better, but Peanut was fantastic, and he was probably the most consistent member. But like I said earlier, it really was all 5 members of Gen.G that really did step up and win this game for them. I think without the team effort at the end, this would have been a lot more difficult. You're looking at players like Chovy, who I think were really good down the stretch of this game, really mattered a lot in those team fights, and specifically the 1-in-4 Rumble in the top lane for Doran. He was really a big reason why the team had a few problems in the mid game. The Blitzcrank hooks were flying around just in general, and Doran was unfortunately, a little bit of a detriment during that stage of the game. But man, when things really mattered the most, that Rumble can still deal a lot of damage in those team fights, and he really showed up when it really did matter. So credit to him, credit to Doran. He still was doing quite a bit of damage in this game, but Pays and Delight were solid. Delight was going a little bit too deep on some of those engages, but especially down the stretch, Leona was invaluable towards what this team wanted to do. Just in general, it's hard to highlight 1 or 2 individual players on this team that really made the difference, like a gigantic difference for Gen.G. It really was more of a team effort than anything else, and I think that's a good sign for this team, to be able to keep your cool, to be able to keep your head on straight after you basically give the game away, and to be able to bring it back. It's just a really good thing to see. And then for Hanwha, this has got to be entirely demoralizing. Not only did you have Baron, not only did you have Soul, but you had Azir plus Kai'Sa plus Sejuani plus Aatrox from ahead in the late game. Like, there was really no excuse for you losing this game. You honestly just got outplayed. Now, credit to Zeka and Viper. I think they did everything that they could in this game. Viper in particular was doing a lot of good damage on the Kai'Sa, but people are going to underestimate just how much Zeka was doing throughout this game. I know that there were obviously some things in the late game that people could, talk about, but I do think Zeka was really, really good for Hanwha for the most part in this game. But my dud of the game is going to go to Life in the support position on this Blitzcrank. I think if Blitz was a little bit more active, a little bit more accurate in the back half of this game, I don't think we'd be talking about this nearly as much. Like, there are some priority targets to hit on Gen.G, whether it's the Rumble, whether it's the Chase, whether it's the Xayah, ideally, which obviously is going to be a lot more difficult with Xayah Ultimate, but there are a lot of priority targets you can go after if you're the Blitzcrank, and if you don't get any of them, if you end up pulling in the Leona, all of a sudden these fights become a lot more difficult, and that just kind of ended up being the case, especially if you just become Peel in the late game. You all of a sudden don't really have a reliable way to start a fight without Aatrox or Sejuani just kind of going in and basically dying instantly, and so very, very difficult stuff from Hanwha Life, but you can't really take it away from the 2 damage carries. I think they did everything that they were supposed to in this game, and, for Zeka and Viper, I think they were positive. Grizzly could have been a little bit more active in the late game. Kingen definitely could have been a little bit more in the late game. I think that the Aatrox game was definitely not nearly as good as what Doran was able to show in game number 1, but in general, I do think that Hanwha had some positives here. They just weren't able to hang on to the massive lead that they themselves were able to generate, and so certainly you got to keep your head on straight, but I can imagine being entirely demoralized by a loss like that. Hopefully that's not the case for this HLE team, because they are on series point now. If they lose this, they're going to be going down to lower bracket to be joining KT Rolster, and Gen.G is going to be moving on to winners finals to take on T1, the eternal matchup, which obviously has become closer and closer with this 2-0 series lead, but HLE isn't out of the water yet. Are they going to show that they can at least stay, positive in this series? They can at least take one game, or is Gen.G going to say, no, we're just a little bit too talented here, our matchup's just a little bit too good, we're going to put you down in a 3-0 sweep? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to close out this series pretty darn quick, and they're going to get that 3-0 sweep to move on to winners finals. I knew that this series would be pretty Gen.G favored. Talked about it a lot in the preview, why I thought that. Because, again, a lot of HLE's offense runs through Grizzly, and Peanut has done a phenomenal job of shutting down junglers that just aren't as good as him, and that's unfortunately what Grizzly is at this moment. As much as I do like Zeka and Viper, it's just never going to be enough to be able to cut through what Gen.G has as a unit, and that's really the best way to describe how this series ended up going. This was a unit diff. This is a 5v5 diff, not necessarily any sort of individual one player being better than individually another player. It's just Gen.G being the better team overall, and I think they proved that here. They did almost throw away game 3 again, with 2 games in a row that they almost threw away, and only in order to bring it back, I should say, but they were able to salvage it. Chovy was simply too good to lose in this game, and that's kind of the case for a lot of the members of Gen.G, I would say, overall. Player of the game in game number 3, and my de facto, I guess, player of the series is going to go to Chovy. I am going to give him player of the series overall, as well as player of the game for game 3, because I do think he was the the most consistent member of the team throughout the entirety of the series. However, this is certainly a team award in this series more than it is an individual player award. Chovy's going to get it because I do think, like I said, he was the most consistent, but everybody was player of the series. Gen.G was player of the series in this one. I don't think any one particular player really stood out all that much more than the rest of the team. I do think that this was more of a team effort than any of the other series that I've covered up until this point, not only in the LCK, but basically in any other region. This was just everybody on the team showing up and kind of doing their part, specifically the jungle mid duo, in my opinion, which were really the two that I was debating over, Peanut or Chovy, to give player of the series to, but I ended up giving it to Chovy. I think you could give it to Peanut. Really good game on the Poppy that he helped popularize last year in the jungle. He just continues to be so good. This champion continues to be so good. There are so many champions that I consider to be kind of overvalued, overplayed at the current moment. In the jungle, Nocturne definitely being one of them. Poppy is so good. I don't understand why Poppy doesn't have higher play rate in the major regions, but it is what it is. I'm not going to complain about it too much. Peanut was just better than Grizzly, especially in this game number 3. You can talk about game 1, Grizzly really falling behind. Game 2 was kind of meh, and game 3, Grizzly had a major problem. We'll get to him, but Peanut was awesome. Doran was also really good in game number 3. Paze and Delight were pretty solid. Certainly the more forgettable part of the map, I would say, for Gen.G, but that's a good thing, because Paze was their focal point for a majority of the regular season. So to see them play weak side, to see Viper, kind of be given resources, allowed to play the game a little bit more, and for Paze to just kind of survive enough to be useful in the late game and not necessarily have to be the focal point in order for Gen.G to win games, like that's what you want to see. You want to see the player that was kind of everything for the team in the regular season be able to take a backseat and have the team still win. That's something that, Hanwha Life struggles with. We kind of saw that with KT. They struggled with Keen having a couple of bad games. I think Paze, being as, secondary as he was in this series is honestly a good sign for Gen.G moving forward. But Peanut and Chovy are absolutely ridiculous. Doran, Paze, and Delight, I should say, are also phenomenal, and this team's going to be moving on to winners finals. And as of right now, I just don't see how you can't see them as favorites to win the LCK. With everything going the way that it is, they're an incredibly dangerous team. And then for Hanwha Life on the other side, they tried their best. I mean, did they? I don't know. They tried their best to come back in this game. Viper in particular, I thought had a really good game on the Zeri. Zeka was still staying active on things like the Yone that obviously he's pretty well known for. But the jungle gap was just simply too big. In this series, Grizzly was not good enough. He's going to get my dud of the game here. And again, this is the problem with Hanwha Life. I don't mean to harp on the things that I've continuously said for 3-4 weeks in a row at this point, but this is exactly what I thought was going to happen to Hanwha. This is a very good call out to me. If Grizzly struggles, this team's not going to win. It really is as simple as that. You can talk about Zeka, you can talk about Viper, and yes, these are very good players, but what they have shown over the course of this year is that if things go wrong for the rest of their team, they're not really the kind of players that are going to 1v9. I love Viper, and I think mechanically speaking, you put really good players around him, he's going to do more with that than almost any other ADC in the entire world, but Viper doesn't 1v9, or at least he hasn't for Hanwha Life over the course of this year, and so definitely something to keep in mind. If Grizzly's going to struggle, especially going up against these really good teams, obviously we'll preview the series against KT in a second, but if Grizzly continues to struggle, I think Hanwha Life is going to continue to struggle. Their ups and downs, I think, are almost going to entirely be directed towards what he's able to offer. Now, the rest of the team was not very good. Kingen had a rough series, was certainly worse than Doran in basically every matchup that they ended up playing, even on his signature Aatrox pick. Zeka was fine. I think Viper was fine. Life was kind of irrelevant, but in a way where I don't think he was actually all that good. Not irrelevant in a way where it's he just couldn't do all that much because the rest of the team was losing, but irrelevant in the sense of, I think if he had been a little bit more active, there actually could have been a lot that could have been done on the side of Hanwha, but it just wasn't meant to be. So overall, that's going to be, them moving down to lower bracket. Obviously, they still have the talent and the potential to make a run here, but with the top 3 teams looking as good as they are, Hanwha's definitely in for maybe a rougher playoff experience than a lot of people were anticipating. And then for Gen.G on the other side, this is a very, very, very good team. They're going to move on to winners finals here, and they've got a big path ahead of them. Obviously, nothing is set in stone and nothing is done for them, but this team looks incredibly dominant, and I think we all could have expected that with this roster coming into the split. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK round number 2 overview and analysis video. Do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, up on the screen is going to be the updated LCK playoff bracket. We can see T1 and Gen.G taking off into that winners finals, and KT and Hanwha Life moving down into that lower bracket. So let's go ahead and preview those series very quickly before we move on to the outros. Of course, starting off with T1 versus Gen.G. I do believe that series will happen first. I could be wrong, but either way, it's going to be one of these two series. series. And talking about this one, it's a very interesting matchup on paper, of course. This is the inevitable. It's just what we always get in the playoffs. I could absolutely see a world in which either one of these teams ends up moving on. I think Gen.G is a little bit more stable at the current moment, but man, T1 has been playing at a ridiculously high level over the course of the last few weeks. Again, I could see T1 winning this, but I think my prediction is going to have to be Gen.G in this one. And then for KT versus Hanwha Life, I do think that matchup-wise, this is kind of interesting. I think you're looking at a team that is really good as a unit versus a team that is a lot more focused on individual players in Hanwha Life. I do think that should favor KT Rolster, though. I think their roster as a whole is a little bit more adaptable, a little bit more well-suited, I would say, for a best-of-5 playoff series, and I think they show that they can hang with some of the top dogs like T1. But I think Hanwha Life is just a little bit overmatched at this level. I do like this team, and I do think that they are probably considerably better than, like, the others in the LCK at the moment, but I think the top three are really kind of solidified for me, and unfortunately for Hanwha, KT is in that top three. But I'd love to know what you guys think of those two series down in the comment section below. What do you think is going to happen? Do you disagree with me? Do you think one of those two teams that I have losing is going to go over? Would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions, of course, in a constructive way down in the comments below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We cover all of the major regions on this channel, and with Worlds right around the corner, this is a perfect time to hit subscribe. I really do appreciate you guys sticking around and watching a lot of these videos. We're covering the LCS, the LEC, Championship. The qualifiers are going to start up soon. LPL just finished off. You can go check out those videos, but be sure to hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. We'll, of course, be posting about the entirety of the LCK playoffs as well, and so stick around. I'm sure you're going to like a lot of the videos if you liked this one. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.